Story 1: I used to work the graveyard shift at a gas station on the outskirts of town. Not the best gig, but it paid the bills, and it was usually quiet enough to pass the hours without too much trouble. The place was in one of those in-between areas, not quite rural, but far enough from the city that we didn't get much traffic at night. Mostly truckers, a few night owls, and the occasional drunk looking for cigarettes or snacks. It was a little after 3 a.m., and I was mopping the floor, trying to shake off that heavy, dead-of-night fatigue that always seemed to hit around then. That's when I heard the soft buzz of the doorbell. I looked up and saw her standing outside, just on the other side of the glass door, staring in. She was tall and painfully thin, with limp blonde hair that looked like it hadn't been washed in days. Her clothes hung off her frame, some kind of faded pajama set that was too big for her, and she was barefoot. I didn't think much of it at first. We got all kinds of people at odd hours, and it wasn't my job to judge. I hit the buzzer to let her in and called out, "Good evening." She didn't respond, just walked in with this stiff, awkward movement, her arms hanging at her sides like she didn't quite know what to do with them. I went back to mopping, glancing up every few seconds to keep an eye on her. I've learned the hard way not to ignore customers, especially the odd ones, but she didn't head for the shelves or the cooler. She just stood there, about 4 feet from the counter, staring straight at me. Her face was completely blank, no expression at all, just pale skin stretched tight over sharp cheekbones. Her eyes were dark, sunken in, and she didn't blink. Not once. I felt this cold ripple run down my spine, and I cleared my throat. Can I help you?" My voice echoed a little in the empty store. She didn't answer, didn't even twitch, just kept staring, her eyes locked on mine like she was looking straight through me. I forced myself to keep moving, pretending to focus on the mop, but I could feel her eyes on me, heavy and unrelenting. After a minute or two, she turned away, but even as she walked through the aisles, she kept her face angled toward me, her head twisting at an unnatural angle so she wouldn't break eye contact. It was unsettling, to say the least. She moved in this weird, jerky way, like her limbs didn't quite belong to her. Once she even walked backward, her feet shuffling along the tiles as she kept her eyes fixed on me. I was starting to feel genuinely unnerved. She wasn't saying anything, just moving around the store, staring and muttering something under her breath that I couldn't quite make out. Her lips barely moved, just a faint whisper that didn't sound like words. More like a low hiss, almost rhythmic, like chanting. She finally came up to the counter, her bony hands dropping a pack of gum and a small bottle of water. Her mouth was still moving, that soft hissing noise slipping out, and her eyes were locked on me, unblinking. I forced a smile, trying to keep my voice steady. "Will that be all?" She didn't answer, just kept whispering. I could finally make out a few words, repeated over and over in this eerie, sing-song voice. "Not mine, not mine, not mine." I tried to ignore the chill crawling up my neck and scanned her items. "That'll be $3.50. She tilted her head, her neck cracking with the motion, and stopped whispering. Her mouth stretched into a smile, but it was wrong. Too wide, her lips pulling back to show her teeth. Yellowed, jagged, and far too many of them. Then she started laughing. It was a harsh, croaking sound, like her throat was filled with gravel. It didn't match her face, didn't match the hollow look in her eyes. It was completely out of place, like she was imitating something she'd heard once, but didn't quite understand. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest, my fingers going numb as I held out her change. She didn't take it, just stood there, laughing that awful, broken laugh, her body swaying slightly. I dropped the coins on the counter, my hands shaking, and took a step back. "You, have a good night." Her laughter cut off, instant and unnatural, like someone had hit a switch. Her face went blank again, the smile vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. She scooped up the change with those skeletal fingers, turned around and walked toward the door, backwards, never breaking eye contact. The door buzzed as she left, and she stood outside for a moment, her face pressed up against the glass, her eyes still locked on me, wide and unblinking. Her breath fogged up the window, and she lifted one hand, slowly dragging her fingers down the glass, leaving streaks behind. Then she was gone, disappearing into the darkness. I stood there for a long moment, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I kept expecting her to come back, to see that face pressed against the window again, those eyes staring through me. But she didn't. The rest of the shift passed in a blur. I stayed behind the counter, my eyes flicking to the door every few seconds. I couldn't get that laugh out of my head, that raspy, broken cackle that didn't sound human. Story 2. I worked the night shift at a gas station just off the interstate. It was one of those 24-hour places with bright fluorescent lights that buzzed overhead and aisles stacked with stale chips and overpriced energy drinks. I didn't mind the hours. I preferred the quiet. Not many people rolled through between midnight and dawn, just the occasional trucker or someone who got lost on their way to somewhere better. My boss, Tony, was strict about safety. Every night before he left, we did a site walk together. He'd check all the locks, make sure the bathrooms were empty, and remind me to always stay behind the counter unless I was cleaning. The store's doors only opened if I pressed the green exit button behind the counter, and I never opened them unless I saw someone standing outside. There were cameras everywhere, inside, outside, even in the bathrooms. But they only showed the sink area, nothing too invasive. Tony said it was for liability reasons. That night it was dead. Not a single customer since Tony left at 11. I busied myself with the usual routine, stocking shelves, wiping down counters, sweeping the floor. Around 1:30, I headed to the men's bathroom to clean up. It wasn't too bad, just some water splashed around the sink and a few paper towels on the floor. I did the mirrors first, then the faucets, gave the toilet bowl a quick scrub. Standard stuff. I left the bathroom to grab the mop, which was propped against the storage room door in the back. I was gone maybe 2 minutes. When I came back, the smell hit me before I even opened the door. It was rancid, thick enough to taste. I gagged, pulling my shirt up over my nose. Then I saw it, an entire outfit laid out in front of the toilet. Shoes first, then socks neatly beside them, tracksuit pants, underwear, a t-shirt, everything you'd need to fully dress someone. And on top of it all was the biggest, most disgusting pile of shit I'd ever seen. It was smeared across the shirt, soaking into the fabric. I stumbled back, nearly slipping on the freshly mopped tile. My mind spun, trying to make sense of it. I had just been in there. The bathroom was spotless. No one had come in. I was sure of it. I would have heard the door chime, and I definitely would have seen them on the cameras. I rushed back to the counter and locked myself in the safety cage, my hands shaking as I pulled up the security feed. I rewound the footage, staring at the screen. It showed exactly what I remembered, me walking into the bathroom, cleaning, and then leaving to get the mop. Nothing else. No one entered or exited. I played it again, slower this time. I watched myself walk down the aisle, watched the door swing shut behind me. I even checked the other angles, the parking lot, the front door, the back hallway. Nobody, not a shadow, not a flicker. It was impossible. I was alone, completely alone. The minutes crawled by as I sat there, locked behind the counter, staring at the bathroom door. I half expected someone to walk out, maybe laughing at the prank they'd pulled. But nothing happened. The store was silent, except for the hum of the coolers and the buzz of the lights. I knew I had to clean it up. Tony would see it on the morning review, and he'd be pissed if I left the bathroom like that. My paycheck depended on him trusting me to do my job, no matter how messed up it got. I grabbed the cleaning supplies, my hands trembling so hard that the spray bottle rattled. I forced myself to walk back, keeping my eyes on the floor. When I opened the door again, the stench hit me even worse than before. I gagged, fighting back the urge to vomit. The outfit was still there, just like before. Shoes, socks, pants, underwear, t-shirt, all perfectly arranged. It didn't look tossed or messy. It looked placed, like someone had stood there and stripped down carefully, like they wanted to leave everything behind. I couldn't do it. I couldn't clean it up. My body refused to move, my feet glued to the tile. I felt this heavy, suffocating pressure, like the room itself was alive, breathing down my neck. I backed out, my eyes never leaving that pile of clothes and shit, and slammed the door shut. Back behind the counter, I locked myself in again, My hands were shaking so bad I could barely dial Tony's number. He didn't pick up. I left him a voicemail, stuttering over my words, trying to explain what I'd found without sounding insane. I spent the rest of the shift behind that counter, staring at the bathroom door. The hours dragged, the clock ticking loud in the silence. Every so often, I'd hear a creak or a shuffle, but I told myself it was just the building settling. I didn't believe it, though. Not really. When Tony showed up at 6, I must have looked like hell because his face went pale the moment he saw me. I handed him the keys without a word and walked out. I didn't wait to see his reaction when he went to check the bathroom. I didn't care. I just needed to get out of there, to feel the cold morning air on my face, to breathe something that wasn't tainted by that rancid smell. I never went back. Story 3. I used to work the graveyard shift at a gas station on the edge of town. It was one of those places that stayed open all night, the kind of spot truckers and drifters would pull into when they were too tired to keep driving. My manager always joked that I was the only one stupid enough to take the shift, but honestly, I didn't mind it. It was usually quiet, and the worst thing I ever had to deal with was the occasional drunk stumbling in for cigarettes or snacks. That night was colder than usual. I remember it clearly because I kept rubbing my hands together and blowing into them to keep warm. The heater in the booth behind the counter was on the fritz again, humming and rattling without actually kicking out any heat. I was half watching the security monitor, half scrolling through my phone when I saw him pull up. His car was an old, beat-up sedan, one headlight flickering as he coasted up to the pump. It was the only vehicle I'd seen in hours. He sat there for a moment, engine running, before he killed the lights and stepped out. He moved slowly, like he was tired or sore, but I couldn't get a good look at him because of how dim the parking lot was. I didn't think much of it until he walked through the door, and I noticed the blood. It was everywhere, spattered across his face, smeared down his neck, soaking into his shirt. His jeans were stiff with it, dark patches staining the fabric from the knees down. He moved with this strange stiffness, his shoulders hunched, head down. When he looked up, his eyes were hollow, like he wasn't really seeing me. He walked straight past the counter to the back of the store, where the coffee machine was. I was frozen, my mind scrambling to make sense of what I was seeing. I thought maybe he was hurt, that he'd been in some kind of accident, but he didn't move like he was hurt. He moved with purpose, like he knew exactly what he was doing. I watched him the whole time, my eyes locked on him as he grabbed a cup and filled it with coffee. The store was dead silent except for the hum of the cooler and the drip of the coffee machine. He grabbed a candy bar from the rack beside the counter on his way up. When he stood in front of me, I could smell the blood. It was coppery, metallic, thick in the air. My stomach turned and I tried to keep my face neutral, but I must have looked horrified because he tilted his head, his lips twitching like he was trying to smile. "That everything?" I asked, my voice coming out shakier than I'd meant. He nodded, his eyes never leaving mine. He didn't say a word as I rang him up, my hands trembling so badly I almost dropped his change. He took the coins from my palm, his fingers cold and sticky. He turned to leave, but then he paused, his body going rigid. I saw his shoulders rise and fall as he took a deep breath. He looked back at me, his face expressionless, but his eyes, they were hollow like he was somewhere far away. "Don't worry," he said, his voice flat, almost mechanical. "It's not my blood." Then he walked out, the doorbell chiming softly behind him. I watched him through the window as he climbed back into his car, his movements slow and deliberate. He sat behind the wheel for a moment, staring straight ahead before he started the engine. The one headlight flickered to life, and he pulled out of the lot, disappearing into the darkness. I stood there for what felt like forever, my heart thudding in my chest. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it. Not his blood? Then whose blood was it? What the hell had happened to him? I thought about calling the cops, but what would I even say? A guy covered in blood bought a coffee and a candy bar? He didn't threaten me. He didn't do anything illegal. But the look in his eyes, I couldn't shake it. That hollow, distant stare, like he'd seen something no one should ever see. I went to the door and locked it, flipping the open sign to closed, even though I still had a few hours left on my shift. I turned off the lights and sat behind the counter, listening to the hum of the cooler and the rattle of the broken heater. Every noise made me jump. I kept replaying his words over and over in my head. "It's not my blood." I never saw him again after that night. I watched the news for weeks, expecting to hear about some brutal crime or an accident, something that would explain the blood. But nothing came up. No missing persons, no bodies found, no reports of a man covered in blood. It was like he'd vanished. I quit the job a few weeks later. Story 4. I used to work the night shift at an ARCO/AM/PM station off the highway in rural Oregon. It was one of those lonely stretches of road where hardly anyone came by after midnight, and the only company I had was the fluorescent buzz of the overhead lights. That night, the fuel attendant called in sick, which meant I was running both the register and the pumps until the morning guy showed up at 4. I didn't mind. The work was dull, but I was used to it. I had my routine: clean the coffee machines, restock the cooler, sweep the floors. But by 1 in the morning, I was just staring at the clock, counting down the hours. That's when I heard it. A faint, scratching noise coming from the back storage room. At first, I thought it might be a raccoon. We got them sometimes, especially out here where the woods crept up behind the gas station like they were waiting to swallow it whole. I grabbed the flashlight we kept under the counter and made my way to the back, the beam cutting through the dark hallway that led to the storage room. The noise stopped as soon as I got close. I hesitated, my hand on the doorknob, listening. Nothing, just the hum of the refrigeration units. I shook my head, feeling a little stupid, and pushed the door open. The room was empty, just shelves stacked with paper towels, cleaning supplies, and boxes of snacks. Everything was exactly where it should be. I took a step in, shining the flashlight around, the light flickering a little as I moved. My eyes scanned the room, looking for any sign of an animal, a knocked-over box, some chewed-up insulation, but everything was normal. I turned to leave, and that's when I heard it again. A scraping sound like claws against metal, coming from the other side of the emergency exit at the back of the storage room. My heart skipped, but I tried to stay rational. Probably just a coyote or a raccoon trying to get in. I walked over to the door, feeling the cold seeping through the metal. I smacked the door hard with my palm, the noise echoing through the room. "Get out of here!" I shouted, hoping to scare it off. That's when it happened. A voice, hoarse and broken, like the words were being dragged out of a throat that hadn't spoken in years. It came from the other side of the door, so close I could feel the breath through the crack at the bottom. "Die! Die! Die!" I stumbled back, my shoulders slamming into the metal shelving behind me, cans of glass cleaner clattering to the floor. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear anything else. But that voice, it kept repeating, each word more twisted, more desperate than the last. "Die! Die! Die!" I wanted to believe it was some drunk playing a sick joke, but the way that voice sounded, it was wrong. Too raspy, too hollow. It didn't sound human. I fumbled for the door handle, my hands shaking as I yanked it open and stumbled out of the storage room, slamming the door behind me. I stood there in the hallway, my back pressed against the cold cinder block wall, trying to catch my breath. The store was dead silent. I strained my ears, waiting to hear footsteps or the chime of the front door opening. Anything to prove that it was just some crazy person messing with me. But all I heard was that same sickening whisper, now muffled but still clear enough to make my skin crawl. "Die! Die! Die!" I ran to the front of the store, locking the main door and grabbing the phone behind the counter. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely dial 911. It rang twice before a calm, detached voice picked up. I explained that someone was outside, yelling threats, trying to get in. They said they'd send a patrol car to check it out. I hung up and stood there staring at the storage room door from across the store, half expecting it to burst open. The voice had stopped, replaced by an eerie, suffocating silence. I didn't dare go back to check. I just stood behind the counter, my fingers wrapped so tightly around the phone that my knuckles turned white. It felt like an eternity before the red and blue lights flashed outside. I unlocked the door, practically dragging the officer inside, babbling about the voice, the screams. He looked skeptical but agreed to check the storage room. I followed close behind, staying a few steps back as he drew his flashlight and pushed the door open. The room was exactly as I'd left it, neat, organized, nothing out of place. But the officer kept going, unlocking the emergency exit and stepping outside. I hesitated before following, the cold night air hitting me like a slap. There were no footprints, not in the frost-covered dirt, not near the door, nowhere. The ground was undisturbed, like no one had been there at all. The officer shone his flashlight around, his breath clouding in the air, then turned back to me with that look, the one that says, "You're wasting my time." "Probably just an animal," he said, shrugging. "Sound can play tricks on you at night." I didn't argue. I just wanted him to stay, to stand there in the room with me until the morning attendant showed up. But he was already heading back to his car, giving me a nod before driving off, the tail lights disappearing down the highway. I went back inside, locking every door, every window. I didn't go near the storage room again, just stood behind the counter, jumping at every sound until the first light of dawn crept through the glass. I quit the next day. Story 5. I worked the late shift at a gas station just outside town, one of those 24-hour spots with flickering lights and an old security camera system that barely worked. It was never busy, not past midnight, just truckers fueling up and the occasional lost soul wandering in for a pack of smokes or an energy drink. I didn't mind it. I liked the quiet. That night, I was restocking shelves, making sure everything looked neat for the morning shift. It was just me and my coworker, Amber, but we barely saw each other unless one of us had to cover the register. I was in one of the aisles near the back, front-facing the chips, lost in the monotony of the task. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Amber step out from the back room. The stockroom door made a little noise when it opened, just a soft whoosh of air and the faintest click. I glanced over, barely turning my head, just enough to register her dark hoodie and the way she always walked a little fast, like she had somewhere more important to be. I turned and followed her toward the register, not in a rush, just moving along as I finished fixing a few bags. She was ahead of me, rounding the corner to the front counter, and for a second, I was just watching her walk. The store was silent except for the hum of the refrigerators. She turned the corner. I did too, right after her. "Amber?" I said her name, not loud, just enough to get her attention. She wasn't there. The register area was empty. I stopped in my tracks. My stomach knotted up instantly, a sick, tight feeling. I looked around, even stepped behind the counter, expecting her to be crouched down, maybe grabbing something. But she wasn't. The only sound was the buzzing of the overhead lights and the faint whoosh of cars passing outside. I stood there for a second, blinking, my brain trying to catch up. I had just seen her. I had followed her from the back room to the front. I had practically been staring at her. "Amber," I called again, louder this time. "Yeah?" Her voice came from the other side of the store, near the bathrooms. I whipped around so fast my vision blurred. She was standing near the restrooms, looking at me like I was crazy. My mouth went dry. "Were you just at the register?" She frowned. "No. I've been over here the whole time." I felt something cold crawl up my back. My hands were clammy. I saw you. I followed you from the back room." She shook her head. "I never went in the back room." For a second, neither of us spoke. My mind was racing, trying to piece it together. It wasn't like I had just thought I saw movement or mistook a shadow. I had followed her, watched her walk, spoke to her. Amber must have seen something in my face because her expression shifted. "What did you see?" I didn't know how to answer. My heart was pounding now, hard and fast. I looked toward the backroom door, expecting it to move, to hear that soft whoosh of air again, but it didn't. Everything was still. Amber walked closer, eyeing me like I was about to pass out. "Dude, you're pale as hell. You okay?" I wasn't. I felt like the air had changed, like the whole store was slightly off balance, tilted at an angle no one else could see. I had followed something that looked like Amber, something that moved like her, something I had believed was her up until the second I spoke her name, and it was gone. I didn't go near the back room for the rest of the shift. I didn't look toward it, and I didn't check the security cameras. I didn't want to see what they had recorded. Story 6. I was 15 when I got my first job at a gas station. It wasn't one of those bright, shiny ones with clean floors and fresh coffee. No, this was the kind of place that felt like it had been rotting from the inside out for years. Off the highway, barely standing, ceiling tiles sagging with water damage, the walls stained from decades of cigarette smoke. Dust clung to every surface, and a sickly, sweet stench of old oil and mold hung in the air. The people I worked with weren't exactly the wholesome type either. Meth heads, ex-cons, people with that twitchy, sunken-eyed look that told you they'd seen and done things better left unspoken. My shifts were mostly evenings, which meant I was responsible for the final cleanup. The worst part? Taking out the trash. The dumpster sat about 50 yards from the back door, alone in the dark, under a single flickering light. The lot stretched out behind it, lined with parked semi-trucks where drivers would spend the night. The idea of walking out there alone always put me on edge, but I told myself it was just my imagination running wild. Nothing was out there, just me, the dumpster, and the night. One night, close to midnight, I grabbed the last trash bag and pushed open the back door. The cold air hit me instantly. It had rained earlier, and the smell of wet pavement mixed with gasoline fumes. The light above the dumpster buzzed, barely keeping the darkness at bay. Beyond that, just blackness, stretching out into the endless cornfields. I forced myself forward, crunching over the gravel, trying to ignore the way my gut clenched. The plastic bag in my hand was slick with something, probably old soda or fryer grease. I swung it up and over into the dumpster, the sound of impact louder than I expected in the quiet. Then I heard it. "Hey, boy!" I froze. My breath caught in my throat. The voice was quiet, almost a whisper, coming from somewhere near the semi-trucks. I turned, scanning the darkness, but saw nothing. Just the silhouettes of the trucks, looming like massive beasts in the night. Their windows were dark, no engines running, no movement. My heart pounded against my ribs. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe it was just the wind or the buzzing of the light playing tricks on me. I took a step back toward the gas station, suddenly eager to be inside. "Psst, hey boy!" The voice came again, clearer this time. My skin prickled. It wasn't just some random noise. Someone was out there watching me. I swallowed hard and forced myself to speak. Hello? Can I help you?" Silence. Then from somewhere deep in the shadows, a low, rasping voice hissed, "Come here." Every instinct in me screamed, "No." I stood frozen, my breath coming in short, shaky gasps. I still couldn't see anyone. The darkness beyond the trucks was thick, unnatural. I had the overwhelming sense that if I took a step closer, I wouldn't come back. I took a step back instead, and then, right as I turned to leave, "Hey boy!" The voice exploded through the night, deep and furious. It wasn't a request anymore. It was a command. I ran. My feet barely touched the ground as I sprinted back toward the gas station. The gravel shifted under me, nearly making me slip. My lungs burned, but I didn't stop. I could feel something behind me, something chasing me. I crashed through the door, slamming it shut behind me and locking it in one fluid motion. My co-worker, a wiry guy with rotten teeth named Daryl, looked up from counting the register. "The hell's wrong with you?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. I couldn't speak. I was doubled over, gasping for air, my hands shaking so bad I could barely keep myself upright. Finally, I managed, "There's someone out there," Daryl snorted. "Yeah? It's a gas station, kid. People come and go." I shook my head violently. "No, man. Someone's out there, in the lot. They were talking to me, yelling at me." Daryl's face shifted, not to concern, but to something colder, less amused. He glanced toward the back door, then out the front windows at the lot beyond. It was empty. The semis sat still and lifeless. No movement, no sign of anything at all. "Yeah," Daryl muttered after a long pause. "That happens sometimes." My stomach twisted. "What do you mean?" Daryl didn't answer right away. He just went back to counting, his fingers methodically sorting through the bills. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower. "Old owner, before this place shut down for a few years. He disappeared one night. Last time anyone saw him, he was taking out the trash. Cops said he probably ran off, but people say different." My mouth went dry. What do they say? Daryl shrugged. Say a trucker picked him up. Say he got into some bad shit. But my uncle, he worked here too back in the day. Said he heard it himself, same as you. A voice calling from the dark. Right before the old man vanished, I stared at him, my whole body cold. You're messing with me. He looked up, dead serious. Wish I was. Neither of us said anything after that. I clocked out, went straight to my car, and didn't look back as I pulled out of the lot. The whole way home, I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, expecting to see someone sitting in my back seat. I never worked another night shift alone again, and I never took the trash out after dark. Story 7. I used to work the night shift at a gas station in a small town. Real small. One of those places where the only reason people even pass through is to get to somewhere better. It was the kind of town that felt empty even during the day, and at night it was downright dead. I liked working the night shift though. Hardly anyone came by after dark, so I could just sit behind the counter, sip on bad coffee, and let my mind wander. Plus, I was never much of a morning person. It was a Wednesday night, I remember that clearly. My shift started at 7 p.m., and my coworker, Rachel, had left almost as soon as I walked in. She was in a hurry to get home to her kids, and I didn't mind. I preferred being alone at night anyway. Less small talk, more peace and quiet. The first few hours went by just as I expected, slow and uneventful. I sat behind the counter, scrolling through my phone, occasionally glancing up at the security monitors. The pumps were all empty, and the store itself was silent, except for the hum of the coolers in the back. I watched the clock crawl from 8 to 9 to 10. Not a single customer. Not unusual for a weeknight. It was just after 10 when I got up to stretch my legs. I walked the aisles out of boredom, straightening up bags of chips and rearranging candy bars. I thought about heating up one of those sad-looking gas station hot dogs, but the thought alone made my stomach turn. When I was done pretending to look busy, I wandered back behind the counter and plopped down on the stool, leaning back until I felt it wobble under my weight. I was just about to put my feet up when I heard it, the bathroom door slamming open. Not just opening, but slamming hard enough to make the walls rattle. I jumped up so fast that I nearly knocked over my coffee. I looked up at the security monitors, my eyes darting from screen to screen. Nothing at the pumps, no one in the aisles. But the bathroom door was wide open, swinging back and forth like someone had burst out of there in a hurry. Then I saw him. A man staggered out of the bathroom, stumbling like he'd just woken up from a nightmare. He was sweating, his face pale and slick, his eyes wide and wild like a cornered animal. His hair was matted to his forehead, and his chest heaved with heavy, ragged breaths. He looked right at me, and for a second I was too stunned to move. We just stared at each other, my heart hammering in my chest. Then he bolted, full speed, straight out the door. The bell above the entrance gave a violent jingle as he shoved the door open so hard it nearly cracked the glass. I rushed around the counter, my legs feeling wobbly beneath me, and ran to the door just in time to see him disappear into the darkness. There were no cars in the lot, no headlights down the road. He was just gone. I stood there for what felt like ages, staring out into the empty night, waiting to see if he'd come back, if maybe he was on something and just lost his mind for a second. But there was nothing. Just the dim streetlights casting long shadows across the cracked pavement and the low hum of the neon open sign buzzing behind me. I walked back inside, the door creaking shut behind me. My hands were shaking and my stomach felt tight, twisted. I tried to replay the last few hours in my head, tried to remember if anyone had come in before him, but I couldn't. As far as I could remember, I hadn't seen a single soul since my shift started. Not one customer, no cars at the pumps, nothing. The realization hit me hard and my blood ran cold. If no one had come in, how long had he been in that bathroom? I turned and looked down the short hallway that led to the customer restroom. The door was still open, swaying slightly as if it was breathing. I took a hesitant step forward, then another. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it echoing in my ears. The hallway felt impossibly long, and the shadows seemed to stretch and twist the closer I got. I stopped just outside the doorway, staring into the small, dingy bathroom. The fluorescent light above the mirror flickered weakly, casting a sickly yellow glow. The air was thick, heavy with the stench of sweat and something else. Something sour. I took a step inside, my shoes sticking to the grimy tile floor, and looked around. There was nothing. No sign that anyone had been in there. But the mirror was fogged up, streaked with lines like someone had dragged their fingers through the condensation. I reached out, my hand trembling, and touched the glass. It was warm and wet, like someone had been breathing on it. Then I saw the writing, faint but unmistakable, scrawled across the fogged mirror in messy, uneven letters. "Let me out." My breath caught in my throat, and I stumbled back, my shoulder slamming into the doorframe. The room felt suddenly cold, the air sharp and biting against my skin. I looked around, half expecting to see that man standing behind me, but the hallway was empty, just shadows and silence. I ran back to the front of the store, my heart racing, my skin prickling with fear. I grabbed the phone and dialed the police, my fingers fumbling over the buttons. When the dispatcher picked up, I could barely get the words out, my voice shaking as I tried to explain what had happened. They sent an officer out, more out of courtesy than anything else. Nothing ever happened in this town. The cop showed up about 15 minutes later, a middle-aged guy I'd seen around before. I told him everything, about the man, about the mirror. He walked down the hallway, looked in the bathroom, and came back shaking his head. "There's nothing there," he said, his voice flat, almost annoyed. "Mirror's clean. No writing, no fog." I didn't believe him. I went to look for myself, but he was right. The mirror was spotless, clear as day. It didn't make sense. It was there. I saw it. I know I saw it. The cop asked if I'd been drinking or if I was on anything, and I could hear the skepticism in his voice. I told him no, that I was just tired, and he left without another word, shaking his head as he walked out the door. I didn't finish my shift that night. I quit a few months later. Story 8. I used to work the night shift at a gas station in a tiny town off the highway. The place was dead most nights, and I liked it that way. It meant I could sit behind the counter, sip on stale coffee, and stare at the buzzing fluorescent lights until my shift ended. The town itself was one of those places people only stopped in because they were lost or running on fumes. It wasn't the kind of place people stayed. We didn't get much foot traffic, and when we did, it was usually truckers or drifters. There was only one bathroom, outside around the back of the building, a single heavy metal door that stuck when it rained and creaked like hell when you pushed it open. It had one stall, one urinal, and a sink with a mirror so cracked it was like looking into a broken puzzle. I hated that bathroom. It was cold and damp, even in the summer, and the light above the sink would flicker at the worst times. It was around 2:30 in the morning when I first noticed the guy. I didn't hear him come in, which was strange because the door had a bell that jangled like mad. He was just there, standing by the coffee machine, staring at it like he didn't know what to do. His clothes were filthy, layered like he was prepared for a blizzard, even though it was barely chilly out. His hair was a tangled mess, matted down on one side like he'd been sleeping on the ground. His hands were shaking. I cleared my throat, and he snapped his head up, his eyes locking onto mine. There was something off about his face. His eyes were sunken, surrounded by dark shadows, and his skin was stretched tight, almost shiny. He looked sick, like he hadn't eaten in days. "You need help with something?" I asked, trying to sound casual. It wouldn't have been the first time a homeless guy wandered in, looking for a place to warm up. He didn't answer, just stared at me. Then his mouth twitched, like he was trying to smile but didn't remember how. It was unsettling. "The bathroom around back," he mumbled, his voice hoarse and low, like it hurt him to speak. "Got a key?" I hesitated. Normally, I didn't give out the bathroom key after midnight. Too many drifters shooting up or passing out in there. But something about the way he looked. I figured he needed it more than most. I grabbed the key from under the counter and tossed it to him. He caught it with a shaky hand, his fingers barely closing around it before he turned and shuffled out the door. I watched him through the front window as he disappeared around the corner, his steps uneven, like one leg was shorter than the other. Minutes passed, then half an hour. An hour? I knew I needed to get that key back. but the thought of going out there made my stomach knot up. I kept telling myself he'd come back any minute, but by 4 o'clock, I was out of excuses. I grabbed the spare key and a flashlight, stepping out into the cold air. The building was silent, the hum of the neon sign the only sound as I made my way around the corner. The bathroom door was closed, but the light was on, spilling out from the crack at the bottom. I knocked. "Hey man, you all right in there?" No answer. I knocked again, louder this time. "You've been in there a while. I need the key back." Silence. I tried the door, but it was locked. The key slid in easily, and the lock clicked open. I hesitated, hand on the handle, a cold sweat breaking out on the back of my neck. I pushed the door open. The light flickered, casting long shadows that danced along the cracked tiles. The air inside was damp, heavy, and smelled of mildew and something else. Something sour, like spoiled meat. The stall door was shut, the dirty sneakers visible under the gap. He was facing the wrong way, his feet pointed toward the wall. I felt a chill run down my spine. "Hey, you okay?" No answer. I took a step inside, the door creaking as it swung shut behind me. I was only a few feet from the stall, but every step felt like I was wading through mud. My heart was pounding, and I realized I was holding my breath. I reached out and knocked on the stall door. "You all right in there?" The shoes twitched, just a tiny movement, like he'd heard me. Then they began to turn. Slowly, impossibly, his feet rotated, the toes scraping against the floor as they twisted around, his knees bending the wrong way. They kept turning, inch by inch, until they were pointing directly at me. I stumbled back, my shoulder hitting the sink. I gripped the edge to keep from falling, my mind reeling. It wasn't possible. Legs don't bend like that. The stall door creaked, the metal hinges groaning as it began to open. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The door swung wide and he was there, standing backward, his head twisted at an unnatural angle, face staring over his own shoulder. His mouth hung open, wider than it should have been, the skin stretched, torn at the corners. His eyes were rolled back, nothing but white. He took a step toward me, his neck cracking as his head tilted, the mouth twitching. The light flickered again, and his shadow warped, stretching across the floor toward me. I ran. I didn't look back. I slammed through the door, my shoulder bursting with pain as it hit the frame. But I didn't stop. I rounded the corner and threw myself through the gas station's front door, locking it behind me. My chest was heaving, my hands trembling as I backed away from the glass. I never went back to that gas station. Story 9. I've been working the morning shift at the gas station for about 6 months now. It's not exactly my dream job, but it pays the bills, and it's quiet enough that I can ease into the day without too much hassle. I have to be there by 5:30 a.m., which means I'm usually up by 4:45. That early in the morning, the town's still asleep, and the only people out are truckers and the occasional stray dog. It's always dark, the kind of darkness that feels thick, almost heavy. The gas station itself is a little out of the way, set back from the road behind the main store. To open up, I have to swing by the main building first to grab the keys from the back office. It's just routine at this point. I drive past the station, the lights all off and the pumps silent, get the keys and head back to open up. But that morning was different. I was running a bit behind, so I was driving faster than usual. As I passed the gas station, my headlights swept over the lot, and that's when I saw them. 2 figures standing all the way in the back, right where I usually park my car. They were perfectly still, side by side, just standing there. I barely got a glimpse before I sped past, but it was enough to make my heart lurch. It wasn't just that they were there. That was weird enough on its own. But there was something wrong about them. They were pitch black, darker than the night around them. No faces, no features, just silhouettes. It looked like someone had cut 2 human shapes out of the world. I tried to shake it off as I pulled into the main store's parking lot. Maybe they were just a couple of kids messing around, or maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me because I was still half asleep. But the more I thought about it, the more unsettled I felt. Kids don't stand that still. People don't stand that still. Inside the main store, I found my manager, Greg, already counting down his drawer from the night shift. Greg's an older guy, rough around the edges but dependable. He's the type who's seen it all and doesn't scare easy. I hesitated for a second, feeling stupid for being spooked by a couple of shadows, but I couldn't get the image out of my head. "Hey Greg," I said, trying to sound casual. "Did you see anyone hanging around the gas station when you got here?" He looked up, his brow furrowing. "Nah, just the usual ghosts," he joked, then saw the look on my face. "Why? You see something?" I didn't want to sound crazy, so I just shrugged. "Probably nothing. Just thought I saw a couple of people back where I park." It was dark, though. Greg's face hardened. "Homeless, maybe? Damn it, I told corporate we need better lights back there." He grabbed his jacket. "Come on, let's check it out." I didn't argue. I didn't really want to go back there, but I wasn't about to tell Greg that. We walked out to his truck, and I climbed in the passenger seat. As we pulled out of the lot and headed toward the station, my stomach was doing flips. I kept my eyes on the spot where I'd seen them, and expecting them to be gone, or for Greg to start laughing and tell me I was seeing things. But as his headlights swept over the lot, they were still there. Exactly where I'd seen them, exactly the same. Two black figures standing side by side, perfectly still. They didn't move, didn't react to the light, just stood there. "What the hell?" Greg muttered, slowing the truck to a crawl. "You see that?" "Yeah," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. "I saw them earlier." Greg pulled the truck up, the headlights washing over the figures. They didn't look any clearer, just two human-shaped voids, blacker than black, like the light couldn't touch them. I felt my skin crawl, every hair on my body standing on end. "What are they?" I asked, more to myself than to Greg. Greg shook his head. "I don't know, but they ain't moving." He opened the glove box and pulled out a flashlight. "Stay here." I wanted to argue to tell him not to go out there, but the words stuck in my throat. I watched as he climbed out of the truck, leaving the door open. He shone the flashlight at them, the beam cutting through the dark, but it didn't land on anything. It just stopped, like it was hitting a wall of black. He walked closer, his shoulders tense, the flashlight shaking a little in his hand. "Hey," he called out, "you can't be hanging around here. This is private property." No response, not even a twitch. Greg took another step forward, then another. He was close enough now that I should have been able to see his shadow fall over them. But there was nothing. His shadow didn't touch them. It was like they weren't really there. I wanted to yell at him to stop, to get back in the truck, but my mouth wouldn't work. I just sat there, frozen, gripping the seat so hard my knuckles turned white. Greg reached out like he was going to touch one of them. His hand stopped just an inch away, and for a second he stood like that, frozen in place. Then he stumbled back, tripping over his own feet and falling hard on the pavement. The flashlight clattered out of his hand, spinning away. He scrambled back to his feet, eyes wide, face pale. He didn't look at them. He just turned and ran back to the truck, slamming the door shut. "Go!" he choked out. "Go! Go! Go!" I didn't need to be told twice. I threw the truck into reverse, my hands shaking so bad I almost missed the gear shift. As I backed away, I looked at the figures one last time. They hadn't moved. They were still standing there, side by side, perfectly still. We didn't speak as I drove back to the main store. Greg was breathing hard, his hands gripping the dashboard like he was trying to hold himself together. I could still see the terror in his eyes, the way his face had gone pale. Whatever he'd seen or felt when he reached out to touch them, I didn't want to know. We parked in front of the store, the familiar lights spilling out onto the pavement, warm and safe. Greg didn't get out right away. He just sat there staring at his hands. What were they?" I finally managed to ask. Greg shook his head, his voice hollow. "They weren't people. I don't know what they were, but they weren't people." I never parked in the back lot again. Story 10. I worked nights at a gas station for 3 years. Small town, edge of a bigger city, out past the suburbs and right before you hit real country. Meth labs in the woods, truckers rolling in from both directions, and just enough drifters passing through to keep things interesting. The station sat right off the highway, 4 hours between two major cities. That meant we got everyone. Truckers, lost tourists, cops, junkies, the kind of people who only stop when they have no choice. It was quiet most nights, but when something happened, it was never normal. That night had been slow. I liked slow nights, the kind where I could just keep busy, stock shelves, clean up, count down the till in my head. We'd had a delivery truck earlier, so I'd been working through the boxes, breaking them down, stocking the cooler, standard stuff. At some point, I grabbed a box, carried it to the back, dropped it in the storage room, and came right back out. Maybe 20, 30 seconds, tops. That's all it took. When I came back, she was there. At the far edge of the parking lot, right by the fire hydrant, was a girl, slumped over, her back against it, legs splayed out like she'd just collapsed there. And she was dry, completely dried out. I don't mean like dehydrated or something. I mean her skin was cracked, paper thin, stretched over her bones like she'd been dead for days in the desert sun. But she hadn't been there 30 seconds ago. I froze. The parking lot was empty. No cars, no sounds, no movement. Just the girl and the hum of the fluorescent lights over the pumps. I scanned the lot, the road, the dark tree line past the highway. Nobody. No headlights in the distance. No taillights disappearing. No one had dropped her off. No one had driven away. I felt my stomach twist, like I was about to be sick. I thought maybe she needed help, but I couldn't move. Couldn't make my feet step out from behind the counter. Her skin, God, her skin. It wasn't just dry. It looked like it would crack apart if she moved, like old leather left out in the sun too long. I could see the veins under it, dark and shrunken, like they'd been sucked empty. Her head was tilted down, hair hanging in brittle strands over her face. I couldn't see her eyes. Then her fingers twitched. Not much. Just a little jerk, like a dying spider. And then she lifted her head. Her eyes were gone. Not gouged out, not bloody, just gone. Deep black hollows where they should have been, staring straight at me. And I knew in the deepest part of me that she could see me. I don't know how long I stood there. A second, a minute, maybe longer. I just stared back, locked in place by something that felt bigger than fear. Then the lights flickered. Not just in the store, outside too. The fluorescence over the pumps sputtered, buzzing like angry insect, throwing shadows in every direction. I broke. I stumbled back, my heel catching on the rubber mat behind the counter, and my hands smacked the lottery machine. My eyes flicked to the phone. Should I call someone? The cops? An ambulance? I looked back up. She was gone. No sound, no movement, just an empty parking lot. I don't remember breathing for a few seconds. Then I forced myself to move, step by shaky step, around the counter, out onto the concrete. There was nothing there. No footprints, no drag marks, nothing. Just the fire hydrant, standing there like it always had, the pavement dry and undisturbed. I walked around the whole lot, scanning the road, the gas pumps, the dark stretch of highway beyond. No one. But the air felt wrong, thicker, heavier, like the second before a storm, when the pressure drops and everything in your body knows something's coming. I went back inside, locked the doors. The rest of the shift passed in a haze. I don't even remember finishing my stocking. I just remember sitting behind the counter, watching the lot, waiting for something else to happen. But it never did. Thanks for watching. Don't leave before leaving a like to this video. Also hit the subscribe button to support my work. And as always, have a horrific nightmare, my dear.